Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to be teaching a clear, somewhat grounded explanation of the difference between an ego death and ego integration. I'll be sharing the psychological, somatic, and archetypal explanation, all interweaved in one to hopefully give you a better blueprint as to how to navigate working with the ego when you're doing spiritual work, psychological work, and healing work. First of all, let's talk a bit about what an ego death is. An ego death is the collapse of the psyche's organizing principle, the part of us that maintains continuity, identity, and meaning. It's when the ego becomes overwhelmed by the content of the unconscious or the self or a traumatic experience and temporarily loses its structure. It can happen through intense spiritual experiences, psychedelics, breakdown moments, extreme emotional overwhelm, and a sudden confrontation with the truth that the ego is not ready to integrate. There are some signs that you could be experiencing an ego death, and this is when you're feeling disorientated or you're experiencing dissociation, things not quite feeling real, being confused with who you are, everything losing its meaning, even experiencing terror, or it could even be a sense of bliss, spiritual bliss. You also experience a loss of boundaries and a sense of oneness with everything without any sort of personal identification with who you are. So there's no like personal center. Think of the ego as the boundary between the inner and outer world, and that's what its sacred role is. So when that boundary collapses, the contents of the inner world begins blurring in with the outer world, and everything becomes foggy. Therefore, the experience of disorientation, everything is one, I don't know who I am, and no sense of centeredness within all of that. And this happens because that boundary, the ego, is not strong enough to be able to hold all the contents of the unconscious material that has been coming through via these psychedelic spiritual or breakdown or emotional surge in a traumatic experience that the individual has gone through. Therefore, it collapses. And in a lot of spiritual spaces, this ego death experience gets framed as enlightenment when really it's just your ego getting overwhelmed. It's like the ego then dissolves into something vast, but at the cost of psychological stability. And these types of experiences, they can feel very expansive, and people go hunting for them. People put them up on a pedestal. And this is what we're going to get to in a moment. It's not integration. It's the psyche temporarily losing its center. And that's going to happen at times. It's certainly happened to me. But I think, there are some spiritual or psychological methodologies out there that really promote losing the psychological center and completely removing the boundary between the inner and outer world and remaining in this, blissed out, dissociated type state where I would say it's a form of escapism and disempowerment. So now I want to share with you the difference between ego death and ego integration. And so this is what ego integration is. Ego integration is the strengthening, organizing, and maturing the ego's transformation around deeper truths, not around its complete destruction and collapse. We can call this individuation, integrating the shadow. We're integrating more of the contents of the unconscious whilst there's still being psychological stability of the ego. And we can also call that experiencing more wholeness. By building a stronger vessel in this way, instead of intentionally or unintentionally trying to dissolve one of the components of the psyche's structures, the ego becomes more coherent, more regulated, and more aligned with the self. By pursuing this route rather than ego death, you're going to be experiencing more of a clear sense of identity, more of a calm, regulated nervous system, healthier boundaries, a stronger center of gravity, an ability to hold complexity, embodied emotions, being able to discern reality without collapsing, and being able to navigate shadow unconscious material without being overwhelmed and flooded. Integration means that the ego can now handle what was once overwhelming, and the psyche becomes more bridged and interconnected rather than fragmented and gapped. This means that we're not feeding into collapse, fantasy, dissociation, or false transcendence, but rather experiencing truth. So the core differences is ego death means the ego collapses, whereas ego integration means the ego evolves. So an ego death can feel like everything that I thought was true is gone, and everything means nothing, and I don't know who I am. Whereas an ego evolution is, I know who I am. I am now building on top of the structure that was there before. This more immature, it could be like a childlike psychology or interpretation and perception of reality. So the evolution of the ego is building on top of that structure into a more mature, individuated form. Ego death is all about trying to remove your identity, like you're no one, whereas ego integration is just about transforming your identity. It's the difference between a rupture and a resurrection. And now from a trauma and nervous system perspective, ego death mimics dorso-vagal nervous system shutdown. And people can confuse this type of experience with awakening or enlightenment, but it's not. It's your system literally getting flooded and overwhelmed and therefore shutting down. Whereas ego integration is ventral vagal resilience. So having the groundedness to be present and being able to feel without completely collapsing. And this doesn't mean that you're not going to have a cathartic experience or a big emotional release. It can very much look like that, but it just means that what's coming through to you, you're not being flooded and overwhelmed. You still have that boundary there to be able to take in the contents of unconscious material without completely losing yourself. And now from a spiritual perspective, ego death happens, well, people pursue it when they're trying to transcend their humanity, while ego integration is all about evolving their humanity and really claiming the truth of their humanity. It's like you're learning how to inhabit your humanity fully and embody that. Whereas ego death, it is a form of bypassing that I think, when we're doing this spiritual healing type work, we don't want to promote. We still want to include the integration of the ego in wholeness with all the other structures of the psyche. And now look, ego death type experiences, I don't want to promote fear or anything like that, but I just invite you all to discern these types of experiences that you may have or may have had, or people may be inviting you to partake in without you perhaps really knowing what it is that you're getting into. So just to have the discernment to take a moment to understand what sort of ideology or beliefs that these people that are promoting these types of spiritual practices are encouraging you to do. And that it's important that you are doing ego strengthening work, and that it does have structure rooted in your authenticity, in embodiment, in your humanity. So that, whatever it is that you're entering into within the shadow unconscious material, it doesn't completely flood your personality and, destroy that boundary there between the inner and outer world. So integration is the core of individuation, which is just you becoming who you are. So in one sentence, ego death is the collapse of the self. Ego integration is the evolution of the self. How'd you find this video? Hope you found it helpful. Drop a comment on what your thoughts are, and be sure to subscribe to my channel. This video, really enjoyed doing it. I had a question on my Instagram page. Someone asked me, what's the difference between ego death and ego integration? And so thanks for inspiring me to make this video. If you have any ideas of any other videos that you'd like to see, just comment below and I'll be sure to create that for you all. Much love.